What would you do if your child was dying and the only person who could save them was a king who executed every woman who dared to contradict him? This is the story of Sarah, a desperate mother who walked 3 days to face King Darius, a tyrant who had hanged 17 women for the simple crime of speaking against his will. But when Sarah stood before his throne, she said something so powerful, so devastatingly true, that it shattered everything this cruel king believed about power, fear, and strength. Today I'm going to tell you an incredible story about courage that changed the fate of an entire kingdom, about a mother's love that conquered a tyrant's heart, and about the words that can bring even the cruelest ruler to his knees. But before we dive into this amazing tale, I want to know, what city are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. I love connecting with viewers from all around the world and seeing how far these powerful stories travel. And if you're ready for a story that will give you chills, make you believe in the power of courage, and show you that sometimes one person really can change everything, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because stories this incredible don't come around every day. Trust me, you won't want to miss what Sarah said to this king that changed history forever. Are you ready? Let's begin. King Darius of Blackmoor had perfected the art of silencing dissent with a noose, and the gallows in the castle courtyard had claimed 17 women in 3 years of his reign. Each execution served as a reminder that in his kingdom, feminine contradiction was treason punishable by death. The latest victim, Lady Catherine, swayed gently in the morning breeze, her crime having been a single sentence. Perhaps, Your Majesty, diplomacy might succeed where force has failed. Those 8 words had sealed her fate as surely as if she had drawn a blade against the crown. Darius watched from his window, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came from demonstrating the price of challenging royal judgment. The king's reflection in the rain-streaked glass revealed a man of 32 whose handsome features had been sharpened by years of constant vigilance against threats both real and imagined. His dark hair was cropped short in military fashion, his jaw set with the permanent tension of someone who expected betrayal from every quarter. The crown that rested on his brow had belonged to his father, King Marcus the Kind, whose gentle reign had ended in civil war when ambitious nobles exploited his merciful nature to tear the kingdom apart from within. Fear keeps them honest, Darius murmured to his reflection, adjusting the golden circlet that sometimes felt heavier than any armor. The lesson had been written in his father's blood across the throne room floor, carved into young Darius's memory by the sight of assassins cutting down the most honorable man who had ever worn the crown. Marcus had died believing in the fundamental goodness of his subjects, trusting in counselors who sold his strategies to enemies and nobles who opened castle gates to rebels in exchange for promises of greater power under a new regime. Darius had learned from that weakness, transforming his inherited gentleness into controlled brutality that kept potential traitors paralyzed with terror. Where his father had welcomed counsel from all quarters, Darius demanded silence from any voice that might encourage dissent. Where the old king had shown mercy to captured enemies, Darius wielded the executioner's axe like a surgeon's blade, cutting away the cancer of rebellion before it could metastasize into full revolution. His mother's betrayal had taught him the most valuable lesson of all, that feminine voices, with their appeals to emotion and mercy, were the most dangerous threats to royal authority. Queen Elena had seemed the perfect royal consort until the moment she opened the castle gates to her husband's enemies, believing Marcus too weak to defend the realm against the forces gathering to destroy it. Her reasoning had been cloaked in loving concern for the kingdom's welfare, but Darius had seen through the pretty words to the treachery beneath. His mother's execution had been his first act as king, and the memory of her shocked face when the trapdoor opened still warmed his heart during cold nights when doubt crept into his thoughts like poison seeking to corrupt his resolve. The systematic elimination of contradictory voices had transformed Blackmoor from a kingdom plagued by constant rebellion into a realm where dissent was literally unthinkable. Nobles held their tongues during council meetings, merchants accepted whatever taxes the crown demanded without protest, and even the clergy had learned to interpret divine will in ways that perfectly aligned with royal policy. The price of this stability was measured in women's corpses, but Darius considered it a bargain well made. "No woman speaks against me and lives," he declared to the empty chamber, his voice echoing off walls decorated with portraits of his ancestors, kings who had ruled through strength rather than the feminine weakness that destroyed lesser men. The oath had become his personal creed, repeated each morning as he donned the crown and each evening as he reviewed the day's potential threats to royal authority. Tomorrow would bring new petitions, new opportunities for subjects to demonstrate their loyalty or reveal their treachery through careless words that challenged the fundamental principle of absolute obedience. Lady Catherine's corpse would hang in the courtyard for 7 days, as was traditional for traitors, serving as a reminder to any woman who might consider following her example. The sight of her body turning slowly in the wind would reinforce the lesson that contradicting the king was not merely discouraged. It was impossible to survive. Darius almost hoped someone would be foolish enough to test his resolve again soon. The gallows had been empty for 2 weeks, and he could sense the dangerous stirrings of complacency among his subjects. Nothing maintained proper respect for authority like the regular sound of the trapdoor. 3 days' walk from the capital, in the mud-caked village of Thornwick, Sarah pressed her face against the cracked window of her hovel and watched her 8-year-old daughter Emma waste away from the consumption that had already claimed half the children in their district. The little girl's labored breathing filled the single room that served as their entire world, each rattling cough bringing up blood that Sarah could no longer pretend was anything but a death sentence for a family too poor to afford the medicine that might save her child's life. Sarah's calloused hands, worn raw by years of taking in washing and mending for pennies, traced the fever heat radiating from Emma's too thin frame. The local physician, Master Aldwin, had made his diagnosis with the casual indifference of a man who saw poverty-related deaths as natural as seasonal changes. The medicine Emma needed, imported from the southern kingdoms at enormous expense, cost more than Sarah could earn in 5 years of back-breaking labor. Charity had its limits, especially when the recipients were the widows and orphans of men who had died in the king's wars. "Mama," Emma whispered between fits of coughing that left flecks of blood on her lips, "why won't the king help us? Father always said the king protects his people." The innocent question pierced Sarah's heart more sharply than any blade could have. Her husband Thomas had died believing in royal benevolence, cut down during King Darius's brutal campaign against the northern rebels while defending ideals of service and loyalty that apparently did not extend to caring for the families of fallen soldiers. The irony was sharp as winter wind. Thomas had given his life defending a king who would not spare a copper coin to save the soldier's daughter from a disease that gold could cure but poverty made fatal. Sarah had received notification of her husband's death along with a formal expression of royal gratitude and a pension so small it would not feed them for a single month. The mathematics of survival had driven her to take in laundry, mending, and any other work that desperate hands could perform, but Emma's illness had made even those meager earnings impossible to sustain. For weeks, Sarah had wrestled with a decision that grew more pressing as Emma's condition deteriorated. She had heard the stories whispered in taverns and market squares, tales of women who dared speak to King Darius and paid with their lives for the privilege of voicing dissent. Lady Catherine's recent execution was still fresh news among the common people, her crime of suggesting diplomatic alternatives to military action serving as a warning to anyone who might consider offering unsolicited counsel to the crown. But what did death matter when her child was already dying? What was the value of a life lived in silence while innocence suffered for want of royal mercy that might be granted if properly requested, or if the request came with words powerful enough to penetrate the armor of indifference that surrounded the throne? The decision that had been building in Sarah's desperate heart finally crystallized into resolve born of maternal fury, and the particular courage that comes when someone has already lost everything except the possibility of meaningful sacrifice. The journey to the capital would take 3 days if she walked without stopping, 3 days during which Emma might die alone while her mother pursued the impossible dream of moving a king whose heart had been hardened against exactly the sort of appeal she intended to make. But if there was even the smallest chance that her words might penetrate where others had failed, if her willingness to die for her daughter's life might somehow demonstrate the sincerity that had been lacking in previous petitions, then the gamble was worth making. "I'll be back soon, little one," Sarah lied, kissing Emma's fevered forehead and tasting the salt of tears she had thought were exhausted by months of helpless watching. She pulled on her threadbare cloak, the same one Thomas had worn during his final leave, still carrying the faint scent of the tobacco he had favored, and stepped into the cold morning air that would carry her toward either salvation or certain death. As she walked through the village that had been her entire world for 26 years, she tried not to think about Emma waking up alone, calling for a mother who might never return. Instead, she focused on the words she would speak to King Darius, words that would either save her daughter or add Sarah's name to the growing list of women whose tongues had been silenced by the rope, whose crime had been believing that truth spoken with sufficient courage might somehow penetrate the wall of fear and indifference that surrounded absolute power. The throne room of Blackmore Castle stretched before Sarah like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of absolute power, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows where torchlight could not penetrate and where the souls of the king's victims seemed to linger like smoke from unholy sacrifices. King Darius barely glanced up from his correspondence when the guards dragged the mud-stained peasant woman across marble floors that reflected the light of 100 candles, creating an intimidating brilliance that was designed to make petitioners feel small and insignificant in the presence of royal majesty. Another beggar seeking charity, no doubt. They came weekly now, drawn by rumors that petitions might occasionally be granted if delivered with sufficient groveling and accompanied by demonstrations of absolute submission to royal authority. This particular supplicant looked even more pathetic than usual, her clothes consisting more of patches than original fabric, her hair matted with dirt from days spent walking the dangerous roads that connected remote villages to the capital where power resided in its most concentrated and terrible form. Sarah's eyes adjusted slowly to the overwhelming grandeur of her surroundings, taking in tapestries that depicted scenes of royal conquest and submission, marble columns carved with the names and dates of famous victories won through the application of superior force against inferior enemies, and portraits of previous kings whose expressions had been painted to convey the divine authority that supposedly flowed through royal bloodlines from generation to generation. The throne itself was carved from black stone inlaid with silver that formed patterns suggesting both crown and gallows, a subtle reminder that royal power encompassed both the authority to elevate and the prerogative to destroy. "Your Majesty," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs and the awareness that she was surrounded by armed guards who had witnessed dozens of executions ordered by the man who sat in judgment above her. "I come seeking medicine for my dying daughter. My husband Thomas died in your service at Thornwick Ridge, defending the crown against northern rebels, and I ask only for the means to save the child he left behind when he gave his life for king and kingdom." Darius set down his quill with the theatrical sigh of a man whose patience was perpetually tested by the endless stream of subjects who believed their personal tragedies deserved royal attention. He had heard variations of this story hundreds of times: dead husbands, sick children, desperate families seeking assistance that the crown could theoretically provide but which would set dangerous precedents if granted too freely. The mathematics of kingship required hard choices about which suffering deserved royal intervention, and which could be safely ignored without undermining the broader structures of authority. "Another sob story from another peasant widow," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber and drawing nervous laughter from courtiers who had learned to echo their king's moods as a matter of survival. "Tell me, woman, why should the crown concern itself with every common child who catches fever? The kingdom has no shortage of peasant offspring, and those too weak to survive the normal challenges of life serve no useful purpose to the realm or its legitimate interests." The casual cruelty of his words sent visible shock through even the most hardened members of his court, though none dared voice actual criticism of royal policy. They had all learned to recognize the dangerous glint in Darius's eyes when he sensed an opportunity to reinforce his authority through public demonstration of power over life and death, and they understood that proximity to dissent could easily be interpreted as complicity in treason that would require its own violent correction. Sarah felt the expected fear rising in her chest, but it was overwhelmed by a maternal fury that had been building for months as she watched her daughter slip closer to death, while the kingdom's resources were devoted to wars and building projects that served royal vanity rather than the needs of subjects whose loyalty had been purchased with their husband's blood. The careful speech she had rehearsed during her 3-day journey was forgotten, replaced by words that came directly from the heart of a mother who had already decided that some truths were worth dying to speak. "Because she is your subject, your Majesty," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as righteous anger overcame the fear that should have kept her silent. "The same blood that flows in noble veins flows in hers. The same God that blessed your birth with royal privilege blessed hers with the right to live. You speak of weakness and uselessness, but I see no weakness in a child who fights to survive despite living in a kingdom that values her father's death in your service more than her life and the promise it represents." The throne room fell into absolute silence as the implications of her words registered with everyone present. Sarah had not merely contradicted the king's assessment of her daughter's worth, She had challenged the fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and royal prerogatives that justified his entire approach to governance. Several courtiers stepped backward as if proximity to such audacious honesty might somehow make them complicit in what was obviously about to become the prelude to another public execution designed to reinforce the proper relationship between crown and subject. King Darius rose slowly from his throne, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been anticipation as he contemplated the unprecedented opportunity that had just presented itself. For weeks, the gallows had stood empty, and he could sense the dangerous stirrings of complacency among subjects who needed regular reminders of what happened to those who forgot their proper place in the established order. Finally, a woman had given him the perfect excuse to demonstrate that royal mercy was not weakness and that contradicting the crown remained as fatal as it had always been. "Guards," he said softly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that courtiers had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than any shouted threat. "Prepare the gallows for another lesson in the proper relationship between subjects and their betters." The words should have sent Sarah to her knees in terrified supplication. But instead she straightened her spine and looked directly into the king's eyes with a directness that suggested either madness or a courage so complete that death held no terror for someone who had already lost everything worth preserving. "Wait," Sarah said, and something in her tone made even King Darius pause in his descent from the throne, uncertain why he felt compelled to listen to additional words from a peasant woman whose fate had already been sealed by her previous audacity. "Before you hang me for speaking truth that your courtiers lack the courage to voice, answer me this. Why does a king who claims to fear no enemy spend his reign murdering women whose only weapons are words that challenge his understanding of strength and justice?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and for the first time in 3 years of systematic executions, Darius felt something crack in the armor of certainty that had protected him from doubt about the righteousness of his methods and the wisdom of his policies. The woman's eyes held no fear, no desperate pleading for mercy that might be granted in exchange for appropriate submission, only a calm recognition that some truths were worth dying to speak and that the manner of one's death could itself become a form of victory over tyranny. "You dare question my strength?" Darius demanded, but his voice lacked its usual commanding authority, weakened by the growing awareness that Sarah's calm acceptance of death was somehow more powerful than all the threats and demonstrations of royal power that had cowed his subjects into silence. "You dare suggest that executing traitors who contradict royal judgment represents fear rather than the proper exercise of legitimate authority over subjects who owe absolute obedience to the crown?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, and when she spoke again, her words carried the gentle firmness of a mother explaining difficult truths to a confused child who had mistaken cruelty for strength and isolation for security. "I dare because I have nothing left to lose, Your Majesty, and because my daughter's life is worth more than my safety or your pride. But you kill women for speaking words because you have everything to lose. Every execution represents a truth you cannot bear to hear, that your crown sits upon a foundation of fear rather than respect, that your subjects obey you because they must rather than because they choose to, and that the strongest thing you could do would be to show the mercy your father's memory deserves." The mention of his father sent a bolt of pure rage through Darius's chest, but beneath the anger was something worse, recognition of truths he had spent years denying even to himself. King Marcus had died because of his gentleness, but he had also been remembered with genuine love rather than the terror that was Darius's only legacy. Children still sang songs about the kind king's generosity and wisdom, while Darius knew his own reign would be written in blood and measured by the number of corpses that marked his path to absolute power. "My father was weak," Darius snarled, abandoning the throne to approach Sarah like a predator stalking wounded prey, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with the effort of restraining violence that might provide temporary relief from the uncomfortable accuracy of her observations. His mercy made him vulnerable to traitors and conspirators who exploited his kindness as a pathway to power. His death proved that gentle kings are murdered kings, and I learned from his example that fear is the only currency that maintains royal authority. Your father was murdered by ambitious men who feared his goodness would expose their corruption and make their own cruelty seem unnecessary and evil by comparison, Sarah replied without flinching, her voice never wavering despite the king's obvious preparation for violence that would end their conversation with her blood on the marble floor. But you have become the very monster those men claimed he was too weak to fight. You have proven their justification for killing him by becoming everything he refused to be, everything he died rather than become. The words hit Darius like physical blows, each one designed to penetrate the defenses he had spent years constructing against exactly this sort of moral challenge to his methods and motivations. Sarah's next words would either doom her to a particularly creative execution or accomplish something no army had managed in 3 years of his reign, forcing a tyrant to confront the reality of what he had become and the price his kingdom had paid for his fear-based approach to governance. "Hang me if you must, your majesty," Sarah said, meeting the king's furious gaze with devastating directness that cut through his rage like truth through self-deception. "But know that my daughter will remember her mother died begging mercy from a man too afraid of his own weakness to show strength through kindness rather than cruelty. She will know that her king valued his pride more than the life of a child whose father died defending that same pride on a battlefield far from home. And someday, when she is grown and has children of her own, she will judge which of us was truly brave, the woman who risked everything to save her child, or the king who killed her rather than admit that mercy might be stronger than fear." King Darius stood frozen before Sarah, her words echoing through his mind like the tolling of funeral bells for the just king he might have been if fear had not transformed him into a monster whose strength was measured by the number of women whose voices he had silenced forever. The throne room had fallen into absolute silence, the assembled courtiers afraid to breathe lest they somehow become complicit in witnessing their sovereign's composure crack under the weight of simple truth, spoken with precision that cut deeper than any sword could reach. "You know nothing of strength," Darius whispered, but his voice lacked its usual commanding authority, and carried instead the defensive tone of someone whose fundamental assumptions about power and leadership were crumbling under sustained assault by logic he could not refute or dismiss. "You know nothing of the burdens that come with wearing a crown, the impossible decisions that separate kings from common people who have the luxury of simple moral judgments uncomplicated by the realities of governing subjects who would destroy everything if not held in check by appropriate fear." Sarah's expression softened slightly, transforming from confrontational challenge to something approaching compassion for a man who had clearly been wounded so deeply by betrayal that he had forgotten how to trust in anything except the terror he could inspire in others. When she spoke again, her words carried the gentle firmness of a mother explaining hard truths to a confused child who had mistaken isolation for safety and cruelty for wisdom. "I know that my husband spoke of you with genuine respect, even as he lay dying from wounds received in your service during the northern campaign," she said, her voice carrying across the vast chamber with perfect clarity despite its softness, reaching every corner where courtiers stood transfixed by this unprecedented display of honesty directed toward their feared monarch. "Thomas said you were a good man trapped by circumstances beyond your control, corrupted by advisers who profited from your fear and isolation. I know that the women you've executed were mothers, daughters, sisters, people who loved and were loved despite your belief that their opinions made them dangerous to royal authority." The mention of respect from a dying soldier penetrated Darius's carefully constructed defenses more effectively than any accusation of tyranny could have achieved. For 3 years, he had told himself that the silent obedience of his subjects proved his strength, that their fear was indistinguishable from respect, that the absence of open dissent meant his policies were working perfectly. The possibility that genuine respect might coexist with criticism, that loyalty could survive disagreement, challenged everything he had believed about the relationship between power and the consent of the governed. "Your Majesty," Sarah continued, pressing her advantage with the relentless logic of someone who had spent months thinking about these very questions while watching her daughter waste away for want of royal compassion. "What strength does it require to hang women who have no power to harm you except through words that might make you question your methods? What courage is demonstrated by silencing voices that speak only truth, that offer alternatives to policies that have filled graveyards with loyal subjects while leaving their families to starve in hovels not fit for animals?" Darius felt something shifting in his chest, not his heart, which had been deliberately hardened against sentiment years earlier, but the carefully constructed edifice of rationalization and self-justification that had allowed him to sleep peacefully after each execution, each demonstration of royal power over subjects who had trusted him enough to voice their concerns directly rather than plotting in shadows. Sarah's words were systematically dismantling the foundation of his reign one logical point at a time, forcing him to confront the possibility that his strength had actually been weakness, his wisdom folly, His protection of royal authority, nothing more than the fearful reactions of a traumatized child who had never learned to distinguish between justified caution and paranoid tyranny. The strongest kings in history, Sarah pressed on, sensing his wavering resolve and driving toward the conclusion that would either transform him or provoke the violent reaction that would end her life, were those who listened to criticism and used it to become better rulers, who measured their success by the welfare of their subjects rather than the number of corpses they could produce. You have chosen instead the path of terrified men who mistake the ability to inflict suffering for genuine authority, who confuse the silence of the terrorized with the consent of the governed. My daughter is dying, Sarah said simply, her voice cutting through the ornate magnificence of the throne room to reach something fundamental in Darius that had been buried beneath years of carefully constructed justifications for systematic cruelty, and I came here knowing that my words would probably cost me my life. But I spoke them anyway, because some truths are more important than the lives of those who carry them, because someone must be willing to pay the price for honesty in a kingdom where fear has replaced wisdom as the foundation of governance. Can you say the same about your reign, Your Majesty? Can you name a single act of genuine courage that required you to risk something precious for the sake of what was right, rather than what was expedient? The question hit its target with devastating accuracy, penetrating defenses that had been constructed specifically to avoid exactly this sort of moral examination of royal policies and their human costs. Darius realized with growing horror that every significant decision of his 3-year reign had been calculated to preserve his power, protect his position, or eliminate potential threats to his authority. He had never once risked anything meaningful for the sake of justice, mercy, or the welfare of subjects whose loyalty had been earned through their husband's blood spilled in royal service. His entire identity as a strong king was built upon acts that required no courage at all, only the willingness to inflict suffering on those too weak to resist, too poor to matter, too isolated to pose any genuine threat to the throne or its occupant. The women he had executed for contradicting him had shown more bravery in their final moments than he had demonstrated in 3 years of ordering deaths from the safety of his throne, protected by guards and traditions that made resistance impossible and meaningful opposition unthinkable. Every woman you've hanged, Sarah continued, pressing her advantage with the relentless precision of someone who understood that this moment might be the only opportunity to reach whatever remained of the good man her husband had believed still existed beneath the crown and its terrible requirements, died showing more courage than you have ever demonstrated as king. They risked everything to speak truths you needed to hear, while you have risked nothing except the possibility that someone might disagree with your judgment or question your methods. The accusation struck home with force that left Darius reeling, his carefully maintained composure cracking under pressure that no amount of royal authority could deflect or diminish. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something that might have been shame, not the political embarrassment of making tactical errors, but genuine moral shame for choices that had caused suffering without serving any purpose except the protection of his own fears and insecurities. Sarah took a step closer to the throne, her movement causing visible tension among the guards who had been positioned to prevent exactly such presumption, but something in her bearing, maternal rather than threatening, compassionate rather than aggressive, made them hesitate to intervene. She stood now close enough that Darius could see the tears that had carved clean tracks through the grime on her face, tears shed not for her own impending death but for the daughter who might die alone while her mother pursued the impossible dream of royal mercy. I am not asking you to save me, Your Majesty, she said softly, her words meant for him alone despite the audience of courtiers who strained to hear every syllable of this unprecedented conversation. I knew when I walked through your castle gates that I would probably not walk out again. But I am begging you to save Emma, to show the mercy that would honor your father's memory and prove that his son learned something from his example besides fear of following in his footsteps. The mention of his father in connection with mercy rather than weakness sent another shock through Darius's already unstable emotional defenses. He had spent years telling himself that King Marcus's gentleness had been a fatal flaw, but Sarah was suggesting that mercy might actually be a form of strength, perhaps the highest form of strength, requiring more courage than violence because it involved risk without the guarantee of immediate, visible results. Your daughter, he said suddenly, his voice hoarse with emotion he had not felt since watching his father die. What medicine does she need? What would it cost to save her life? The questions came without conscious thought, emerging from some part of him that had survived 3 years of systematic brutalization of his own better instincts. Sarah's face transformed with hope so pure and powerful that it was painful to witness, her entire being focused on this unexpected possibility that her desperate gamble might actually succeed in ways she had never dared to imagine. "The southern fever medicine, Your Majesty. Master Aldwin says 6 bottles would be enough to cure her completely, but the cost." She named a sum that represented less than Darius spent on a single royal feast, a pittance from the royal treasury that could mean the difference between life and death for an 8-year-old girl whose only crime was being born to parents too poor to afford the medicine that would save her. For several long moments, the throne room held its collective breath as King Darius wrestled with a decision that would either mark the beginning of his transformation or demonstrate once and for all that fear had conquered whatever remained of his capacity for redemption. The choice before him was simple in its implications but revolutionary in its potential consequences. He could order Sarah's execution as planned, maintaining the precedent that had kept his subjects terrorized into silence, or he could choose mercy and begin the difficult process of rebuilding a kingdom based on something stronger than fear. "Captain of Guards," King Darius called, his voice carrying a new quality that his courtiers had never heard before. Not the deadly calm that preceded executions, but something that might have been hope struggling to overcome years of accumulated cynicism and fear. "Send riders immediately to the southern kingdoms. Purchase whatever quantity of fever medicine is available and have it delivered to the village of Thornwick with all possible speed. The cost is irrelevant. Use whatever funds are necessary from my personal treasury." The silence that followed this unprecedented command was so complete that the crackling of torches sounded like thunder in the vast chamber. Courtiers who had witnessed dozens of executions ordered from this same throne found themselves unable to process the implications of royal mercy extended to a peasant woman whose contradictions should have earned her a place on the gallows beside Lady Catherine's slowly rotting corpse. Sarah collapsed to her knees, not in the submission that had been expected of her, but in pure relief that left her unable to support her own weight. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered prayers of gratitude to whatever power had allowed her desperate gamble to succeed beyond her wildest dreams. Her daughter would live, the medicine would arrive in time, and Emma would grow up knowing that sometimes courage and honesty could triumph over fear and indifference when someone was willing to pay the ultimate price for speaking truth to power. "Rise, Sarah of Thornwick," Darius said, descending from his throne to offer her his hand. A gesture so unprecedented that several courtiers gasped audibly at the sight of their king extending physical assistance to a common peasant. "You have shown more bravery in speaking truth to me than most of my knights have demonstrated in battle. Your daughter will have her medicine, but I would ask something else of you as well." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, uncertain what additional request might follow such unexpected royal mercy but prepared to agree to anything that would ensure Emma's survival. The king who stood before her seemed different from the man who had threatened her execution moments earlier. Still imposing, still clearly dangerous, but somehow more human, as if her words had managed to reach past the crown to touch whatever remained of the person he had been before fear and trauma had transformed him into a tyrant. "Teach me," Darius said, his voice carrying the humility of someone who had finally recognized the limitations of power divorced from wisdom and compassion. "Show me how to be the king my father believed I could become, how to rule through strength that doesn't require the constant threat of violence to maintain order. Help me understand how to serve my subjects instead of merely terrorizing them into compliance." The request was so unexpected, so far removed from anything Sarah could have imagined when she began her desperate journey to the capital, that she found herself momentarily speechless. The king who had built his reign on the systematic execution of women who dared contradict him was asking her, a peasant widow with no formal education or political experience, to guide his transformation into something approaching a just ruler. "Your Majesty," she said finally, finding her voice despite the magnitude of what was being asked of her, "I know nothing of statecraft or the complexities of governing a kingdom. I am only a mother who loves her child enough to risk everything for her life. But I know what it feels like to be powerless, to watch injustice destroy innocent people while those with the authority to help choose indifference instead. Perhaps that perspective might be valuable to a king who wants to understand the true cost of his policies." Over the following months, Sarah became an unprecedented addition to the royal court, not as a formal advisor with official title and ceremonial robes, but as a conscience whose presence reminded Darius daily of the human consequences of royal decisions. The gallows in the castle courtyard was dismantled, its stones repurposed for a memorial honoring the women who had died for speaking truths their king had been too afraid to hear. The law making feminine contradiction a capital offense was formally repealed, replaced with protections for free speech that extended to subjects regardless of their gender or social status. Emma recovered completely, her laughter echoing through the castle corridors where she played with other children whose families had been brought to court as part of Darius's efforts to understand the lives of common subjects whose welfare had been ignored for too long. The little girl who had nearly died from poverty-related illness became a symbol of the kingdom's transformation from a realm ruled by fear to one governed by the recognition that true strength came from protecting the vulnerable rather than threatening them. King Darius never forgot the lesson Sarah had taught him through her willingness to die for truth, that the greatest courage was not the ability to inflict suffering, but the wisdom to choose mercy when mercy was difficult, to listen when listening was uncomfortable, and to change when change required admitting that fear had been mistaken for strength and cruelty confused with justice. The kingdom of Blackmore emerged from its dark years as a place where contradictions were welcomed as opportunities for growth rather than feared as threats to authority, where royal power was measured by the welfare of subjects rather than their silence. Years later, when Emma had grown into a young woman whose intelligence and compassion marked her as worthy of the second chance her mother's courage had secured, she would tell the story of the day a peasant woman spoke truth to a tyrant and transformed both their lives forever. The tale became legend throughout the kingdom and beyond, proof that even the most hardened heart could be reached by words spoken with sufficient courage, and that the strongest foundations for lasting power were built not on fear, but on the trust earned through genuine care for those who had placed their faith in royal protection and justice.